the biggest barriers to foreign trade in the coming year? That is the topic of my conversation today with Brian Pomper. He is Executive Director of the Alliance for Trade Enforcement. Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate the invite.
So, what do you think, Brian, just in a broad sense, what are your biggest concerns today about foreign trade barriers?
Well, there are quite a few specific barriers that the associations and the companies who I work with are facing really across the board. So you've got things like digital services barriers. Certainly digital services taxes are a big issue for many in the United States. You've got localization requirements for where data needs to be stored. You have intellectual property barriers where US firms' intellectual property is either being taken from them, used by others without permission, or really not being compensated at a level that's really fair. There's really quite a few. And my group really focuses on commitments that foreign countries have made to us and making sure that they live up to those commitments.
I get the feeling that with foreign countries, there's no lack of quote unquote commitments. Isn't it just more of a question of upholding those commitments? I mean, anybody can say anything they want in a trade agreement, but certainly China has professed to have a great deal of interest in protecting IP of other countries, and we've seen what result that has been. Let's talk a little bit more about IP, though. I mean, where in IP do you think are the most serious problems? Could they be patent protection, copyright infringement, mandated tech transfer? Where are the big concerns there?
Yes.
Okay.
I'd say all of the above. I mean, look, this is actually a very complicated question. We could do an hour just on this specific issue. I would say at a macro level, and speaking as an American, something that I think is very important is this great power competition that we do have with China, where China is targeting specific sectors of the US economy, some of the most productive and the most innovative sectors, things like 5G and AI and biotechnology, biopharmaceuticals, quantum computing, these things that I think many think are going to be the industries of the future. China is focusing on trying to be the leader in the world on those issues so that we'll all end up having to use Chinese products, Chinese standards, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. As an American, and I hope US policymakers look at that and think, boy, we want the United States to continue to be the leader in all of these areas. And so what are the policies that we need to have in order to make that happen? I think that means strong protection for intellectual property, both here in the United States and abroad, making sure that US companies are able to protect what they have, including in China. So stopping forced tech transfer, stronger intellectual property protections for innovators in China, but really all over the world. If you want to get down a little bit more narrowly, I do think, the United States is a tremendously innovative economy. It's where a lot of value is caught up in the United States and our innovative industries, not just patents and trademarks and copyrights, but trade secrets. I think really the United States does better and the US economy will do better when United States policymakers focus on making sure that our innovative industries are able to compete and succeed worldwide.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also talk about trying to reduce our reliance on China for certain aspects of high tech, raw materials and the like, and things like that. Should we be doing a little bit of protection of our own? I mean, I know we're talking about the wonders of free trade here, but should the United States be putting up some kind of barriers in order to promote its domestic tech industries?
Well, I think there's lots of ways to support our domestic tech industries that wouldn't necessarily tie their hands. I don't think it's necessary to say, okay, we need to have completely free and open supply chains, and you can use technology or products from any country in the world, regardless of the national security implications. I think that's a balance, and you need to make sure that obviously national security is being taken account of in that. But there's lots of ways that we can and should support U.S. industries, and that's really where I think U.S. policymakers should be focused.
Where else do you think that our foreign trading partners are not properly enforcing rules when it comes to things like import controls, licensing, certifications, inspections, the kind of onerous bureaucracy that really inhibits the flow of our products into those countries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are legion examples are legion. So, for instance, say in Brazil, there are certification requirements that are unique to Brazil. So they wouldn't accept a certification from, say, Underwriters Laboratories or one of those multinational certification laboratories to say, oh, this is safe for use by consumers. No, it's got to be done in Brazil in a Brazilian laboratory. And of course, that's really just a job creation mechanism for Brazil. And it's duplicative and frankly unnecessary. You've got in many countries around the world systems that really go after the biopharmaceutical industry in particular, where they try to depress the price that countries will pay for those innovative medicines in ways that are, I think, putting a thumb on the scale against innovators, protecting domestic competitors to U.S. innovators, and just generally kind of keeping how these pricing and reimbursement decisions are made behind a black box, so that U.S. companies aren't able to make their case about why this is a particularly valuable product that should be rewarded consistent with its value.
When we wish to express our concerns over the lack of enforcement of rules of this kind, where is the best place to address them, in your opinion? What kind of courts and bodies and organizations do you think we should be pursuing this through?
Yeah, also a good question. There are lots of ways, and of course, this is the business that I'm in, right? So I'm really a lobbyist and an international trade expert. I would say there are several ways to do it. Of course, there is just direct company to country engagement. Often, companies in the United States can advise or help foreign governments in terms of what they're trying to get out of the U.S. government. Famously, when countries want a free trade agreement with the United States, you'll have U.S. companies who have interests in those countries leading the charge for a free trade agreement with that country so that they can then use the contacts and the goodwill that they create to try to get favorable treatment or to have their arguments listened to. So just that kind of even non-governmental type issue. You should also go to the embassies, the U.S. embassies in the countries where you're having issues to get those officials in the embassy raising your issues consistently with their interlocutors in country. You should go to the agencies in the U.S. government that have equities. That's always going to be USTR, probably Commerce, State. Could also be Treasury, could be Agriculture, depending on what the issue is. Could be the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office if it's an intellectual property type issue. And going to those agencies and using their internal mechanisms. So using the reporting requirements that USTR has with the Special 301 report on intellectual property, or the National Trade Estimate on more broadly on trade barriers. So there's lots of tools and levers. You can go to members of Congress who are close with different countries or ambassadors from different countries and have them press your case for you. You can get members of Congress to write letters. You can get the US government to, promise or threaten or otherwise engage with their interlocutors to try to get these countries to pay attention and resolve these issues. So there's really a whole smorgasbord of actions that can be taken. This is what, this is how guys like me make our bacon is by helping companies figure that kind of stuff out.
Yeah, everything you just mentioned is all internal within our own borders, our own agencies and the like. Where can you find satisfaction on a global basis? Can the WTO be a valuable instrument in that way, or has the WTO lost a certain amount of credence over the years that kind of makes it more difficult to use that organization in our interests?
Well, it depends what the issue is, I'd say, with the WTO, but certainly going to the WTO is a resort. It's something that you should think about doing. Mm-hmm. It's hard to do that for every issue, of course. It's a state-to-state settlement or dispute settlement mechanism, so you have to convince the U.S. government to bring it on your behalf. It's useful as a threat to say that you're going to bring that. Countries, in my experience, they don't like to have to be forced into that kind of engagement. So often they'll try to settle things out in advance. They also often don't like to be listed in these reports. And so they try to get themselves out from being listed in these reports. Mm-hmm. All of that is helpful. But in country, you can also just go through the normal type of petitioning process in country that you would do as a, because many companies have people in country who will then press their case with the officials in country, just in the same way we would go to our Congress here, they would go to their policymakers in country. But all of that, I mean, there's you can also do a public relations campaign. There's many tools that you can use to try to call attention to these issues and get the attention of U.S. policymakers, fundamentally, who are the ones who can really press these countries into doing the right thing.
The Trump administration in its 4 years has pursued its trading interests either unilaterally or bilaterally to a certain extent, and seems to have, even though it did oversee renegotiation of the Mexico, Canada, U.S. free trade agreement, seems to seek bilateral one-to-one type agreements. And now we're hearing that a Biden administration would return us to a more multilateral type of approach. How do you feel about that in terms of solving some of these issues?
Yeah, the Trump administration, I remember when it was coming into office, said that they thought they would get a better deal on a bilateral basis negotiating rather than negotiating multilaterally. Mm-hmm. That struck me as a little convenient to argue for an administration that was, candidly, I think, looking for an excuse to pull out of TPP at the time. So I don't think that that's necessarily true or necessarily false, that you get a better deal bilaterally or multilaterally. I think it entirely depends on the circumstance. Now, I think Joe Biden's instincts are much more multilaterally than the Trump administration, than Donald Trump's was. That's not to say that the Trump administration didn't try to work with our allies. I think they certainly did. Query how they went about that. I think putting national security tariffs on our allies shortly after coming into office, these are the Section 232 tariffs, I think that probably turned off our allies toward finding ways to work with us. Mm-hmm. I think Joe Biden is likely to take a much more amenable approach in working with these countries.
Do you think that would be more effective?
I think it could be. It's not to say that countries are just going to roll over and do what we want to do because we say we want to do it. I will say, if I were advising those countries, I would encourage them to find ways to work with the U.S. government, if for no other reason than to try to get the U.S. government policymaking apparatus back into the habit of working multilaterally. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think what you don't want, I think, is you don't want Joe Biden to try this multilateral approach, fail, and be criticized for not having done the way Donald Trump did it, right, and then almost forced into doing things on a bilateral basis.
Not to be considered not tough on trade or something.
Exactly,
like
right. There's no way. And I don't think Joe Biden is weak on trade or weak on, I just think his instinct is going to be to approach these issues more collectively. And certainly with respect to China, I think you'd be hard pressed to find too many trade experts who would say it would not be a good idea to try to get some sort of an alliance of democracies to press China to act in a more responsible manner.
Well, if we think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership as having been formed with the express goal of countering the growing influence of China throughout Asia, to be part of that, it would seem like you would think that would give us more leverage against China on a number of fronts, would it not?
I'm sorry, I missed it. You said that was it TPP?
Would we not have more leverage against China on a number of fronts if we were part of the TPP?
Yeah, well, that was certainly the Obama administration's strategy. And forgive me, let me go back just a little bit so I can tell your viewers here what I'm talking about. I think some people will give the Trump administration credit for saying, "Oh, China is a threat," and somehow they were the first administration to notice that China presented a geostrategic threat to the United States. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think that's true. I think it became pretty clear early in the Obama administration that China was not opening politically and economically in the way that many people thought it would when it joined the World Trading System in the early 2000s. And so Obama's strategy for responding to that was not just TPP, but also TTIP, which was the negotiation with Europe.
Right.
Because you look at that and you think, well, if TPP had been successful and TTIP had been successful, you'd have something like, I haven't done the numbers, but I'd have to say at least 2/3 and probably more of the world economy, all more or less agreeing on a basic set of principles and rules for how one should operate in the world trading system. In that kind of a scenario, China would almost have no other option but to be a rule taker, because if it wanted to sell its goods in these markets, it would have to abide by certain rules. It just wouldn't have those many options. That was the Obama strategy. Now, it didn't work, but nevertheless, I do think TPP is going to be something that the Biden administration is going to have to figure out what to do, not just because it's there and some of the CPTPP countries want us to join, but because, as your viewers may know, China recently concluded a large trade deal in Asia called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which really China at the center. Many of the TPP countries are part of RCEP. I think it's inevitable the Biden administration is going to be asked, how are you going to respond to RCEP as China is trying to consolidate its influence in the Asia Pacific region? How are you going to respond to that? Are you going to try to join RCEP? Are you going to try to renegotiate TPP or join TPP or do something different? So it's definitely a live question.
Well, there is a lot on trade negotiators' plates coming up in the year ahead, and a lot of concerns about foreign trade barriers. Brian Pomper of the Alliance for Trade Enforcement, thank you so much for laying out these issues so clearly for us and giving us an idea of what we have to cope with in the coming months on the trade front. Thanks very much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Robert. It's fun. Appreciate it.